When did a helpful stranger turn out to be your worst nightmare? The moving truck disappeared around the corner, leaving me standing on the sidewalk with my 6-year-old daughter Amy, staring at our new house in Millbrook Heights. The Victorian looked tired in the afternoon sun, its blue paint peeling like old skin, but it was ours. After 18 months of living in my mother's basement following the divorce, we finally had our own space again. Amy clutched her stuffed rabbit closer as she surveyed our new neighborhood, and I felt that familiar knot of anxiety in my stomach. Single mothers moving to unfamiliar places always carried that weight, the responsibility of keeping your child safe in a world full of strangers. I'd chosen this quiet suburban street specifically because it looked safe, with well-maintained lawns and family cars and driveways. What I didn't expect was the man who emerged from the house next door before we'd even unlocked our front door, already walking toward us with a helpful smile that would haunt my dreams for years to come. His name was David Brennan, and he seemed like exactly the kind of neighbor any single mother would want. Mid-40s, wearing a paint-stained polo shirt and work boots, with calloused hands that spoke of honest labor and a warm smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. He introduced himself while Amy hid behind my legs, explaining that he'd lived next door for 8 years and knew how overwhelming moving day could be. Before I could politely decline, he was already lifting boxes from our front porch, commenting on how heavy they were and joking that I must have packed books in every single one. His laugh was genuine and self-deprecating, the kind that put people at ease immediately. When Amy peeked out from behind me, he crouched down to her level and asked about her rabbit, complimenting its purple bow with the serious attention adults rarely gave children's treasures. By the time we'd carried the last box inside, I felt like I'd won the neighbor lottery. David seemed like the protective older brother I'd never had, someone who would watch out for us in this new place where everything felt uncertain. Over the following weeks, David's helpfulness became a constant presence in our lives that I came to depend on more than I should have. When our kitchen sink started leaking on a Sunday morning, he appeared at our door within minutes of my frustrated sigh, toolbox in hand and refusing any offer of payment. When Amy's bike tire went flat, he taught her how to use a tire pump, patiently showing her the proper technique while I watched from the kitchen window, grateful for the male role model she'd been missing since the divorce. He knew exactly when our garbage collection day was and would drag our bins to the curb if he noticed I'd forgotten, leaving them neatly positioned and never making me feel embarrassed about the oversight. His timing was always perfect, appearing just when we needed help most, as if he possessed some sixth sense for our daily struggles. I started to think of him as our guardian angel, the unexpected blessing that had made our transition to Millbrook Heights so much smoother than I'd feared it would be. David's knowledge about our neighborhood proved invaluable during those first months when everything felt foreign and overwhelming. He warned me about the aggressive dog 3 houses down that had a habit of escaping its yard, showed me the safest route for Amy to walk to school, and introduced me to the other families on our street with the easy confidence of someone who belonged. When Mrs. Chen from across the street mentioned that break-ins had been increasing in the area, David immediately offered to install motion sensor lights around our property, spending his entire Saturday afternoon on the project despite my protests about imposing on his time. He seemed to anticipate our needs before we even realized we had them, appearing with a snow shovel before the first winter storm and offering to drive Amy to school when my car wouldn't start on a particularly cold morning. His generosity felt boundless and completely selfless, the kind of neighborly kindness that reminded you there were still good people in the world, willing to help strangers without expecting anything in return. The boundaries between helpful neighbor and family friend began to blur as David became increasingly integrated into our daily routine. He had a key to our house for emergencies, something he'd suggested after a package delivery mix-up resulted in an expensive item sitting on our porch all day while we were out. Amy adored him, running to greet him whenever she saw him working in his yard and chattering about her school day while he listened with the patient attention of a devoted uncle. When my work schedule changed and I needed someone to watch Amy for a few hours after school, David volunteered immediately, assuring me that he worked from home anyway and enjoyed the company. Those afternoons became a regular arrangement, with David helping Amy with homework at our kitchen table while I finished my shift at the accounting firm. I'd come home to find them working on art projects or building elaborate structures with her blocks, and Amy would excitedly show me their creations with the pride of a child who felt genuinely cherished and supported. My trust in David deepened during Amy's bout with the flu that winter, when his care and concern went far beyond what anyone could reasonably expect from a neighbor. He appeared at our door with homemade soup and children's medicine, offering to run errands so I wouldn't have to leave Amy's side while she was sick. When her fever spiked in the middle of the night and I panicked about whether to call an ambulance, David was the first person I thought to call for advice. He talked me through taking her temperature properly and stayed on the phone while I decided whether emergency care was necessary, his calm voice cutting through my maternal anxiety with practical guidance. The next morning, he showed up with orange juice and children's books, sitting beside Amy's bed and reading to her in different character voices that made her laugh, despite feeling miserable. His devotion to her well-being felt paternal in the best possible way, like having a co-parent who genuinely cared about her happiness and health. I found myself wondering how I'd managed to be so lucky, finding someone who treated my daughter with such authentic love and attention. David's integration into our lives reached a new level when he offered to babysit Amy during my first date since the divorce, something I'd been avoiding for months because finding trustworthy childcare felt impossible. Marcus, a colleague from work, had been asking me out for weeks, and David's enthusiastic encouragement finally convinced me to accept. He insisted that Amy would be perfectly safe with him, reminding me of all the afternoons they'd spent together and how comfortable she felt in his care. That Saturday evening, I left them planning a movie marathon with popcorn and blankets, Amy bouncing with excitement about their special night, while David assured me to take as much time as I needed. The date went well, but I found myself checking my phone constantly, worried about leaving Amy with someone who wasn't family despite months of evidence that David was completely trustworthy. When I returned home around midnight, I found them both asleep on the couch with a Disney movie still playing, Amy curled up against David's side like he was her own father. The scene filled me with such gratitude and relief that I actually teared up, finally feeling like we'd found our place in this new community. Spring brought subtle changes in David's behavior that I initially dismissed as signs of increased comfort and familiarity between us. He began dropping by more frequently, sometimes without specific errands or offers of help, just wanting to chat over coffee while Amy played in our backyard. His conversations grew more personal, asking detailed questions about my marriage, the circumstances of my divorce, and my ex-husband's relationship with Amy that felt intimate but not inappropriately so. He remembered everything I told him with remarkable accuracy, referencing conversations we'd had weeks earlier with the precision of someone who'd been taking mental notes. When I mentioned feeling lonely sometimes in the evenings after Amy went to bed, David started texting me more frequently, funny memes and neighborhood updates that seemed designed to keep me company during those quiet hours. His attention felt caring and supportive, like having a close friend who understood the challenges of single parenthood, even though he'd never been married himself. The increased contact made me feel less isolated in my new life, though something in the back of my mind occasionally wondered if his interest was becoming more personal than neighborly. David's helpfulness took on new dimensions when he offered to install a security system in our house after mentioning that he'd noticed someone suspicious walking through the neighborhood late at night. He spent an entire weekend running cables and mounting cameras, refusing my offers to pay for the equipment or his labor, insisting that keeping Amy safe was payment enough. The system was more sophisticated than anything I could have afforded, with cameras covering every entrance and motion sensors on all the windows, controlled by a tablet that David programmed with remarkable technical expertise. He walked me through every feature, showing me how to monitor the feeds remotely and adjust the sensitivity settings, emphasizing how much peace of mind the system would provide when I was at work or away from home. His knowledge about home security surprised me given his background in landscaping, but he explained that he'd learned about these systems while helping other neighbors with similar installations. The cameras made me feel significantly safer, especially knowing that David would also be keeping an eye on things from next door, watching out for any unusual activity in our quiet suburban neighborhood. The first hint that something might be wrong came during a routine system check that David performed about a month after the installation. He mentioned that one of the bedroom cameras wasn't functioning properly and needed to be repositioned, asking if he could access Amy's room while she was at school to make the adjustment. I gave him permission without hesitation, trusting his expertise and grateful for his continued maintenance of equipment that would have cost thousands if I'd hired professionals. That afternoon, he spent about an hour upstairs while I worked in the home office, and when he finished, he reported that the camera was working perfectly now with optimal coverage of the room. His thorough attention to security details impressed me, and I felt reassured knowing that every corner of our house was properly protected by someone who clearly took our safety seriously. When Amy came home from school, she didn't notice anything different about her room, and David's pleased expression suggested he was satisfied with his technical work. I thanked him again for his ongoing support, feeling grateful to have found such a dedicated and knowledgeable neighbor who treated our well-being as his personal responsibility. Summer vacation brought Amy and David even closer together as she spent more time at home while I worked, and his willingness to help with childcare became increasingly essential to our daily routine. He would arrive each morning shortly after I left for the office, spending hours with Amy in our backyard or taking her to local parks and attractions that I couldn't visit during my work week. Their adventures became more elaborate, trips to the zoo, children's museums, and swimming at the community center where David had apparently maintained a membership for years. Amy would greet me each evening with excited stories about their activities, showing me photos they'd taken together and drawings she'd made of their expeditions. David documented everything meticulously, creating photo albums and keeping detailed records of Amy's interests and achievements that rivaled anything a devoted parent might compile. His dedication to her entertainment and development went far beyond casual babysitting, approaching the level of care that felt almost familial. I began to worry that I was taking advantage of his generosity, but whenever I suggested alternative childcare arrangements, David insisted that spending time with Amy was the highlight of his day, and something he looked forward to each morning. The discovery happened on a sweltering July afternoon when I came home early from work with a migraine and found David's house keys on our kitchen counter where he'd left them after his morning arrival. Amy was napping upstairs, exhausted from their trip to the aquarium, and David had stepped out to run errands, planning to return before she woke up. I decided to return his keys immediately rather than wait for him to realize he'd forgotten them, figuring he might need them before coming back to our house. His front door was unlocked, which seemed unusual for someone so security conscious, but I called his name as I entered to avoid startling him if he'd returned without my noticing. The house felt eerily quiet as I walked through rooms that were immaculately clean and strangely impersonal, more like a showroom than a lived-in home. I placed his keys on the kitchen counter and was turning to leave when I noticed something that made my blood freeze. A wall of photographs in his living room that I'd never seen during my few previous visits to his house. Dozens of images that showed Amy and me in moments we'd never posed for, captured through what could only be surveillance. The photographs covered an entire wall from floor to ceiling, arranged with the obsessive precision of someone who'd been documenting our lives for months without our knowledge or consent. Pictures of Amy playing in our backyard, images of me reading on our front porch, shots taken through our windows that showed private family moments I'd assumed were completely secure. The photos were organized chronologically, starting from our first day in the neighborhood and continuing through recent weeks, creating a comprehensive visual record of our daily routines and activities. Some images had been taken from inside our house, including shots of Amy sleeping in her bedroom and photos of me in various states of undress that could only have been captured by hidden cameras. My hands shook as I examined the display, recognizing outfits and moments from specific days, understanding that David had been watching and recording our most intimate family experiences while pretending to be our helpful protector and friend. The violation felt so complete and nauseating that I had to sit down on his couch to keep from collapsing, my mind struggling to process the scope of his deception and the danger we'd been living with for months without realizing it. Among the photographs, I found detailed notebooks filled with David's handwritten observations about our daily schedules, Amy's preferences and fears, my work habits and social interactions, recorded with the methodical precision of a dedicated researcher. He'd documented Amy's bedtime routine, her favorite foods, the games that made her laugh, and the stories that helped her fall asleep. Information that could only have been gathered through systematic surveillance of our private family life. Pages described my emotional state on specific dates, noting when I seemed stressed or lonely, recording conversations I'd had on phone calls that he shouldn't have been able to overhear. The notebooks revealed an obsession that went far beyond neighborly interest, showing months of careful study aimed at understanding every detail of our existence. One section contained what appeared to be future plans, written in David's careful handwriting, describing scenarios where Amy and I would need his help and protection, situations that would make us even more dependent on his presence and care. The realization hit me like a physical blow. David hadn't been protecting us at all, but rather cultivating us, creating the perfect conditions for some purpose that remained terrifyingly unclear. I was photographing the evidence with shaking hands when I heard David's car pulling into his driveway, the familiar sound that usually brought me comfort now filling me with pure terror. My mind raced through options for escape while my body seemed frozen in place, the reality of my situation crashing down with devastating clarity. I was alone in the house of someone who'd been systematically stalking my daughter and me for months, someone who'd gained our complete trust while violating our privacy in ways that made me physically sick to imagine. The sound of his front door opening sent adrenaline surging through my system, and I managed to move toward his back door, praying I could reach our house before he realized what I'd discovered. But David's voice called out cheerfully from the kitchen, asking if I'd come to retrieve his keys, his tone carrying the same warm friendliness that had fooled me for so long. I forced myself to respond normally, thanking him for watching Amy and mentioning that I needed to get back to work, while every instinct screamed at me to run as fast as possible. His footsteps approached the living room where I stood surrounded by evidence of his obsession, and I knew with absolute certainty that my life and Amy's life had just changed forever. David appeared in the doorway with his usual helpful smile, but his expression shifted immediately when he saw my face and realized I'd discovered his wall of photographs. For a moment, we stared at each other in complete silence, the pretense of normal neighborly interaction evaporating as the truth hung between us like a physical presence. His smile didn't fade entirely, but it took on a different quality, less warm, more calculating, as if he were rapidly assessing this new development and its implications for his carefully constructed plans. When he spoke, his voice maintained that same friendly tone, but the words sent ice through my veins as he calmly asked if I'd found what I was looking for and suggested we should probably have a conversation about what I'd seen. The casual way he acknowledged his surveillance made it clear that he felt no shame or surprise about being discovered, only a mild inconvenience that required adjustment to his timeline. I realized with growing horror that David had always known this moment would come eventually, and he'd prepared for it just as methodically as he'd prepared for everything else in his careful campaign to control our lives. My phone was in my purse in our kitchen. Amy was sleeping upstairs in our house, and I was trapped in the living room of a man whose obsession with us had clearly reached dangerous levels. David stepped closer, blocking my path to the back door, his movements deliberate but not yet threatening, as if he still hoped to convince me that his behavior had reasonable explanations. He began talking about loneliness and connection, explaining that watching us had brought joy to his isolated life and that his intentions had always been to help and protect us. His voice remained calm and rational, almost therapeutic, as he described how empty his existence had been before we moved in and how much happiness Amy's presence had brought to his daily routine. The reasonableness of his tone made his words even more disturbing, revealing someone who'd completely convinced himself that systematic stalking and invasion of privacy were acts of love and care, rather than violations that had traumatized us beyond measure. As he talked, I noticed his hands moving slightly, and I realized he was positioning himself to prevent my escape while maintaining the illusion that this was just a friendly conversation between neighbors who'd had a small misunderstanding about boundaries and privacy. David's explanation grew more detailed and disturbing as he described his months of observation, speaking about Amy's development and my emotional state with the authority of someone who believed he knew us better than we knew ourselves. He mentioned specific conversations I'd had with friends, details about Amy's school performance that he shouldn't have known, and intimate aspects of my daily routine that proved the extent of his surveillance network. His security cameras hadn't been installed to protect us from outside threats, but rather to provide him with comprehensive access to our private lives, feeding information directly to his obsessive documentation project. When I asked about the photos taken inside our house, David's expression shifted slightly, showing the first hint of discomfort as he admitted to installing additional recording devices during his various helpful visits and maintenance projects. The motion sensor lights, the security system, the emergency key. Every generous gesture had been designed to increase his access and control, while making us more dependent on his presence and support. His manipulation had been so complete and skillful that I'd actively facilitated my own victimization, thanking him for violations that I'd mistaken for protection and care. The conversation took a darker turn when I demanded to know his ultimate intentions, and what he'd planned to do with the information he'd gathered about us. David's friendly mask slipped further as he described scenarios where Amy and I would need his help escaping from dangers that hadn't yet materialized, situations where his protective presence would become absolutely essential to our survival. His notebooks contained detailed plans for manufactured crises, break-in attempts, stalker threats, emergency situations that would require us to depend on him completely, while isolating us from other sources of support. He'd been building toward a moment when he could position himself as our savior from threats that he himself would create, ensuring that Amy and I would have no choice but to accept his protection and control. The sophistication of his long-term strategy was terrifying, revealing someone who'd thought through every aspect of psychological manipulation and dependency creation. As he explained his vision of our future together, his tone grew more possessive and less rational, and I understood that his obsession had progressed far beyond surveillance into active planning for abduction and imprisonment, disguised as rescue and care. My escape attempt happened when David turned slightly to gesture toward one of his notebooks, giving me a narrow window to move toward the back door. I ran harder than I'd ever run in my life, crashing through his backyard and over our shared fence while screaming Amy's name at the top of my lungs. David followed immediately, his longer legs in better physical condition allowing him to close the distance between us as I stumbled across our lawn toward our house. I could hear him calling out in that same calm, reasonable voice, asking me to stop and listen, insisting that I was overreacting to what had been a simple misunderstanding between friends. His pursuit felt surreal. This man who'd spent months pretending to be our helpful protector, now chasing me across the yard while maintaining his facade of concerned helpfulness. I reached our back door and fumbled with the lock while David approached, still speaking in soothing tones about how we could work through this situation together if I would just calm down and think rationally about what was best for Amy's future and well-being. My hands shook so violently that I could barely operate the key, and I knew that seconds were determining whether Amy and I would escape or become completely trapped in David's carefully constructed nightmare. Amy was awake when I burst through our back door, probably roused by my screaming, and the sight of her confused, sleepy face nearly broke my heart as I realized how close we'd come to a fate I couldn't bear to imagine. I grabbed her hand and my purse in the same motion, pulling her toward our front door while David's voice called through our house, closer than I'd expected, meaning he'd followed me inside despite my desperate attempt to lock him out. Amy started crying as I dragged her through our living room, confused by my panic and frightened by the chaos of our sudden flight from the house that had been our safe haven for months. I could hear David moving through our kitchen, his voice still maintaining that eerily calm tone as he called my name and asked me to please stop running from someone who only wanted to help and protect us. The sound of his footsteps on our hardwood floors, in the house where we'd felt so secure, where he'd been welcome so many times, made me nauseated with the realization of how completely our sanctuary had been violated. We reached our car in the driveway just as David appeared at our front door, no longer bothering to hide his determination to prevent our escape, his helpful neighbor mask finally slipping to reveal the predator underneath. The drive to the police station passed in a blur of Amy's terrified questions and my attempts to provide reassuring answers while my hands shook on the steering wheel. I kept checking my rearview mirror for David's car, half expecting him to follow us, but the street behind us remained empty as we left our neighborhood and everything we'd thought we knew about safety and trust. Amy clung to her stuffed rabbit while I tried to explain that David had been doing bad things and we needed to get help from police officers, simplifying the horror of our situation into concepts a 6-year-old could understand without traumatizing her further. My phone buzzed repeatedly with text messages that I was afraid to check, knowing they were probably from David, still trying to convince me that his behavior had reasonable explanations and that running away was an overreaction to a simple misunderstanding. The familiar streets of Millbrook Heights looked different now, transformed from a safe suburban haven into a place where predators could hide behind helpful smiles and neighborly kindness. By the time we reached the police station, Amy had stopped asking questions and sat in silence, clutching her rabbit and staring out the window with the 1,000-yard stare of someone whose world had just shifted in ways too complex and frightening for her young mind to fully process. Detective Ray Gomez listened to my story with the patient professionalism of someone who'd heard similar accounts before, taking detailed notes while Amy colored at a small table in the corner of his office. The photographs on my phone provided immediate evidence of David's surveillance, and Detective Gomez's expression grew increasingly serious as he scrolled through images that proved months of systematic stalking and privacy invasion. He asked careful questions about David's access to our house, the security system he'd installed, and the timeline of his increasing integration into our daily lives, building a comprehensive picture of sophisticated predatory behavior that went far beyond simple neighborly boundary violations. When I described finding David's notebooks with detailed observations about Amy's routines and preferences, Detective Gomez immediately called for a search warrant, explaining that this level of documentation typically indicated plans for more serious crimes than surveillance alone. His calm competence helped steady my nerves, but his questions about David's potential access to other neighborhood children made me realize that Amy and I might not have been his only targets, that our quiet suburban street might have been harboring a predator whose scope of operation we were just beginning to understand. The search of David's house yielded evidence that exceeded even Detective Gomez's expectations for a stalking case, revealing a level of obsession and planning that transformed our situation from criminal harassment into potential kidnapping and child endangerment. David's basement contained detailed floor plans of our house, schedules tracking Amy's daily activities, and recordings of phone conversations that proved he'd been monitoring our communications for months through illegal surveillance equipment. His computer held terabytes of video footage from hidden cameras throughout our home, including recordings of intimate family moments that made me physically ill to know had been violated and preserved for his obsessive study. Among his possessions, investigators found identification documents and credit cards in false names, maps of remote locations marked with coordinates, and supplies that suggested he'd been preparing for a situation where he would need to transport and hide people for extended periods. Detective Gomez explained that the evidence indicated David had been building toward abduction, using his months of helpful behavior to lower our defenses and gather intelligence that would make us easier to control and manipulate. The realization that Amy and I had been living next door to someone planning our kidnapping while we thanked him for his kindness made me vomit in the police station bathroom, my body rejecting the horror of how completely we'd been deceived. David's arrest happened while Amy and I were staying at my mother's house 2 towns away, receiving updates from Detective Gomez through phone calls that revealed the expanding scope of the investigation. David had attempted to return to his house that evening, apparently expecting to find us at home and continue his campaign of manipulation and control, but instead encountered police officers executing the search warrant and securing evidence of his crimes. His initial reaction had been confusion rather than guilt, according to Detective Gomez, as if he genuinely couldn't understand why his behavior was being treated as criminal rather than helpful and caring. During questioning, David maintained his stance that his surveillance had been motivated by protective instincts and genuine concern for our well-being, showing no recognition that his actions constituted serious violations of our privacy and safety. His complete lack of awareness about the traumatic impact of his behavior revealed a level of psychological disturbance that made me grateful Amy and I had escaped when we did, before his plans could progress to their intended conclusion. The charges against David included stalking, voyeurism, breaking and entering, and conspiracy to commit kidnapping, serious felonies that would likely result in significant prison time and permanent registration as a sex offender. The investigation expanded as Detective Gomez discovered that David's obsession with Amy and me was part of a broader pattern of predatory behavior targeting single mothers and their children throughout the region. His computer contained files on 3 other families he'd been monitoring, including detailed photographs and behavioral notes similar to what he'd compiled about us, suggesting that his helpful stranger routine was a practiced method for gaining access to vulnerable families. 2 of the other mothers contacted by police reported that David had approached them offering assistance with moving, home repairs, or childcare, but they'd declined his help, or moved away before his surveillance could develop into full-scale stalking. A 3rd family had accepted his assistance and reported increasingly uncomfortable interactions that led them to cut contact, though they hadn't realized the extent of his monitoring until police showed them evidence from his computer files. Detective Gomez explained that David appeared to have been perfecting his approach over several years, learning from each interaction to become more skilled at manipulation and less likely to trigger early warning signs that might alert his targets to his true intentions. The scope of his operation made me understand how lucky Amy and I had been to discover his surveillance when we did, before becoming another success story in his expanding collection of victimized families. The trial preparation process revealed disturbing details about David's background that explained his sophisticated approach to stalking and manipulation. Information that made me grateful Amy and I had trusted our instincts and fled rather than trying to confront him directly. Court documents showed that David had been arrested twice in other states for similar offenses, but had avoided conviction through plea bargains that resulted in probation rather than prison time, allowing him to relocate and continue his predatory behavior in new communities where his history was unknown. His employment history showed a pattern of jobs that provided access to family homes, security system installation, landscaping, home repair services, positions that allowed him to identify potential targets and gather intelligence about their daily routines and vulnerabilities. Psychological evaluations ordered by the court revealed a personality disorder characterized by obsessive tendencies and an inability to form appropriate relationships, leading him to seek intimacy through surveillance and control rather than genuine human connection. The experts testified that David's behavior was likely to escalate if left untreated, and that his detailed planning and preparation indicated he posed a serious ongoing threat to public safety, particularly to single mothers and their children who matched his preferred victim profile. Amy's recovery from our ordeal became my primary focus as we worked with therapists to help her process the violation of trust and safety that David's deception had created in her young life. She struggled with nightmares and anxiety, constantly checking locks and asking if we were safe, her 6-year-old mind trying to understand how someone she'd trusted and loved could have been planning to hurt us. The therapist explained that children often blame themselves in situations like this, wondering if they did something wrong to cause the adult's bad behavior. So we worked carefully to help Amy understand that David's actions were his choices and not her fault in any way. The hardest part was explaining why we couldn't return to our house in Millbrook Heights, why all her toys and belongings would need to be replaced rather than retrieved, because the entire property was part of an active crime scene that might be contaminated with additional surveillance equipment. Amy grieved for her bedroom, her backyard, and the life we'd been building there, not understanding why David's actions meant we had to start over again in a new place with new routines. Her resilience amazed me as she slowly began to trust again, but I knew the experience had changed her in ways that would probably affect her relationships and sense of safety for years to come. The sentencing hearing provided some measure of closure as David received 15 years in prison for stalking, voyeurism, and conspiracy charges, with mandatory registration as a sex offender and prohibition from unsupervised contact with minors upon his eventual release. His lawyer had argued for a lesser sentence based on David's mental health issues and lack of prior convictions, but Detective Gomez's testimony about the other families he'd targeted and the sophisticated nature of his planning convinced the judge that David posed an ongoing threat requiring significant incarceration. During the hearing, David finally showed emotion, crying as the sentence was announced and claiming that he'd never intended to hurt anyone, that his actions had been motivated by loneliness and a genuine desire to help and protect us. His tears felt manipulative rather than genuine, another attempt to avoid consequences for behavior he still seemed to view as caring rather than criminal and predatory. As I watched him led away in handcuffs, I felt relief rather than satisfaction, grateful that Amy and I were finally safe from someone whose helpful exterior had hidden such a dark and dangerous obsession. The experience had taught me that trust must be earned slowly and carefully, that even the most seemingly generous actions can hide ulterior motives, and that protecting my daughter means staying vigilant against threats that might come disguised as friendship and support. 3 years later, Amy and I live in a different state where David's case made national news, leading to improved background check requirements for anyone providing home services and increased awareness about the tactics predators use to gain access to families. Amy still remembers David sometimes, asking questions about why he did bad things and whether there are other people who might pretend to be nice while planning to hurt us. Conversations that break my heart but also show her developing awareness about personal safety and appropriate boundaries. We've built a new life surrounded by genuine friends and community members whose kindness comes without hidden cameras or secret documentation, people who respect our privacy while offering real support during difficult times. The experience left scars that will probably never fully heal, but it also taught us both about resilience, the importance of trusting our instincts, and the difference between authentic care and manipulative control, disguised as helpfulness. Every day that Amy grows up safe and happy feels like a victory over the nightmare that David tried to create for us, proof that survivors can reclaim their lives and build something beautiful from the ashes of betrayal and violation. Thanks for watching till the end. Make sure to subscribe and like to not miss the next story.